Have you ever noticed when someone asks, "How are you?" the answer is almost automatic, "Busy." Okay? Sometimes we even say it with a little bit of pride. Busy. You know, as though being busy somehow proves we're important, as though exhaustion is a badge of honor. Spoiler alert, it is really not. It is nothing to be proud of. As if the fuller our calendars are, the fuller our lives must be. Also untrue. Now, this is the point in the sermon where I have to give a little caveat. Sometimes people come up to me after I've preached a sermon and ask, "Were you aiming that sermon at me?" And the answer is always no. I never preach at anyone in particular, usually. Except sometimes, like today, at myself. Because I have been guilty of that busyness thing sometimes myself. Now, I am busy, and honestly, I usually like it that way, because one of the things I learned long ago as a lawyer is that there's nothing quite as stressful as trying to look busy when you're not really, and the partners are looking at you, and you're trying to figure out how I'm going to account for this not busyness in my billable hours, and that's I'm so glad I'm not a lawyer anymore. But we live in a culture that celebrates speed, fast food, high-speed internet, same-day delivery, instant messages, productivity apps, life hacks, multitasking, and we're always trying to save time, and yet somehow, despite all our labor-saving devices, we seem to have less time than ever, or maybe it just feels that way. There's a philosopher, Dallas Willard, and he once said, "Hurry is the greatest enemy of spiritual life in our day." And I think he was onto something. Because hurry doesn't just affect our schedules, it shapes our souls. When we're always rushing, we stop noticing. We stop listening. We stop paying attention. We become impatient with one another. We interrupt before someone has finished speaking, and we scroll instead of seeing, and we skim instead of pondering, and we react instead of responding. And eventually, we begin to believe that our value lies not in who we are, but what we accomplish. So just to reiterate, that is also untrue. And that's really what this sermon is about. It's not a sermon about time management, okay? It's a sermon about identity, about who we become. Because the question isn't, how can I get more done? The essential question is, who am I if I'm not simply what I accomplish? And the gospel offers us another way. It's not a lazy way. It's not an unproductive way. It's just a different way. The pace of grace. And our gospel reading from Mark that Jeffrey read is almost humorous in its honesty. It says, the apostles gathered around Jesus and told him everything they'd been doing, and you can almost hear them talking over one another. "We've been preaching, we've been teaching, we've been healing. You won't believe what happened." And they're excited and they're exhausted. And Jesus notices, and he says something remarkable. "Come away with me to a deserted place all by ourselves and rest a while." And then Mark adds one of those wonderfully human details. "For many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat." They were so busy, they forgot to eat. Now, some of us know exactly what that feels like, and I know it doesn't look like I ever forget to eat. But believe me, it's been known to happen, and it's not pretty when I get hangry, okay? Bad move. Now here's what fascinates me. Jesus is also really busy. incredibly busy, and the crowds are growing, and the people need healing, and the people are hungry, and the religious leaders are criticizing him, and the disciples are constantly needing teaching, and there's always one more village to go to, one more sermon, one more person reaching out for help. And Jesus is not living a quiet, uneventful life, but in spite of that, he never seems to be frantic. He refuses to let urgency become his master. And even after inviting the disciples to rest, the crowds find them. And what does Jesus do? It says he has compassion, and he teaches them. But notice what he doesn't do. He doesn't panic. He doesn't become resentful. He doesn't lose himself in the urgency. And throughout the Gospels, we see this same rhythm again and again. Jesus prays, Jesus walks, Jesus eats with people, Jesus notices children, he notices birds, he notices the lilies of the field. Jesus notices blind beggars that everyone else walks past, and he notices a woman who quietly just touches the hem of his cloak, and he notices Zacchaeus hiding up in a tree, and he notices the people no one else notices. And maybe that's one reason that love and compassion come so naturally to him. He actually sees people. So contrast that with Martha in Luke's gospel. And poor Martha often gets a bad rap. Now, I am certain that Jesus is not criticizing hospitality here. Hospitality is holy work. Let me repeat that. Hospitality, in all of its many forms, is holy work. Someone has to prepare the meal. Someone has to wash the dishes. Someone has to make sure that all the guests are cared for. And the problem isn't that Martha is serving. The problem is that she's become consumed with serving. Now, the Greek word Luke uses suggests being pulled in every direction, dragged around, scattered. And I apologize, but you already know I'm a bit of a language nerd. There's a wonderful little detail hidden in the Greek that doesn't quite come across in English. Most translations say that Martha was distracted. But the Greek word is periaspato, which literally means to be pulled around, or to be dragged in different directions. And it's kind of a vivid picture in that respect. Martha isn't just busy, she's being tugged this way and that by all the demands on her attention. The meal needs tending, the guests need serving, the dishes are waiting. She's being pulled apart. And I'm thinking that little word, periaspato, may be one of the most relevant and modern words in the New Testament. Because we modern people really suffer sometimes from periaspato. We're pulled by our phones, pulled by emails, pulled by work, pulled by family, pulled by the news, pulled by social media. Even good things can pull us in so many directions that we lose our center. And notice that Jesus does not criticize Martha for serving. The word Luke uses for her work is diakonia, which is the same word that gives us deacon, and it means ministry or service, because serving isn't the problem. The problem is that even holy work can pull us in so many different ways that we lose our capacity to be fully present to God, to others, and even to ourselves. Has anybody ever experienced this? Okay. And Jesus gently calls Martha back, not because her work doesn't matter, but because she matters. Her relationship matters, her presence matters, and Jesus offers her grace, the grace to come back to herself, back to God, back to what's essential. And I'm thinking that's a great idea for us today. not simply to do different things, but to do the same things differently. To answer emails without anxiety. I'll work on that. To drive without aggression. And again, I'm preaching to myself here. To have a conversation without secretly composing our next response. To put our phones down long enough to notice the person sitting across from us. Yes, Janet. To become fully present. Because love requires presence. You can't love someone you haven't noticed, and you can't notice someone if you're always hurrying past them. And I sometimes think about the pace at which Jesus traveled. He walked everywhere. 3 to 5 kilometers an hour, that's about the speed of a leisurely walk, fast enough to get somewhere, but slow enough to notice. Slow enough for children to keep up, possibly slow enough for me to keep up. Slow enough for conversations without becoming breathless, slow enough for interruptions, slow enough for compassion. And our world tells us that faster is always better, but the gospel quietly asks, better for what? If we arrive more quickly but fail to notice one another along the way, have we really gained anything? If we accomplish more but become less compassionate, have we succeeded? If our calendars are full and our souls are empty, what exactly have we achieved? There's a biblical scholar that I admire very much, the late Walter Brueggemann. Brilliant guy, brilliant theologian and biblical scholar, and he talks about this in connection with the Israelites when they were slaves in Egypt, and he reminds us that the culture of Pharaoh measured people by what they produced. More bricks, more output, more work, taller pyramids. It wasn't quite capitalism, but I think it had the same effect. And God's answer to Pharaoh wasn't simply liberation from slavery. It was liberation from the belief that human beings exist only to produce. And the God of Exodus is the God who eventually says, stop. Not because the work isn't important, but because you are more important than your work. And that's grace. Grace says your worth is not something you earn. Grace says you're beloved before you accomplish a single thing. And grace says your identity is God's gift, not your achievement. And perhaps that's why Jesus could move through life with such freedom. He never seemed to be trying to prove himself to anyone. He already knew who he was, beloved. And because he knew he was beloved, he could be fully present to the people in front of him. Yeah, I remember sometimes my youngest grandson, he used to, even as a very small child, even when he was like 4 or 5, he'd play by himself, and he had such self-confidence, such self-assurance. And I talked to my stepdaughter, and I said, why do you suppose that is? And she said, it's because he knows he's loved. He has confidence. And sometimes I wonder what would happen if occasionally we simply paid attention to our pace, not judging ourselves, just noticing. When do we hurry? When do we become impatient? When do we stop listening? When do we mistake urgency for important? Because they are not the same things. When do we rush past beauty or people or God? Maybe living faithfully begins with something as simple as paying attention. And maybe following Jesus means learning not only what he taught, but how he lived. Not only what he did, but the way he moved through the world, with compassion, with attentiveness, with freedom, and with grace. Now, I actually have a lot more to say about this, so you'll be relieved to know that I actually divided this sermon into 2 parts. So next Sunday, I want to explore one of God's oldest and most radical gifts for helping us become those kinds of grace-filled people, and it's called Sabbath. Sabbath. But before we learn how to stop one day each week, perhaps this week we can simply begin learning to live our lives at the pace of grace. Because love and compassion have their own pace, their own rhythm. And when we learn that rhythm, we might just discover that the world and our own souls look very different indeed. Amen.